Welcome to this masterclass. I'm William Gumede, Associate Professor at the School of Governance. And this is going to be the last in a series of masterclasses. And thank you for coming. And all of the previous ones have been well attended and it's been very robust and very exciting. So thanks again for coming. Just a little bit of a background of myself. I've been teaching on corporate governance and state-owned companies. I've set up on behalf of the South African government a couple of public entities. And I've also been teaching, working in public entities, chairing a couple of public entity boards, and also chairing audit committees of a number of public entities. You could, this is live, so you could, there's a chat function, and so where you can, if you have any questions, you can put the questions to me, and feel free to put the questions to me anytime. You don't have to wait until I'm done. I'm going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I'm going to respond to questions. I will start now by sharing the screen of my presentation. I mean, just to start off, why should we care about corporate governance in state-owned entities? I mean, I think the very first thing is that since 1994, trillions of money have been spent on bailouts of SOEs and corruption and in mismanagement. So what it means that SOEs has often been a drain on growth, a drain on development, and also a drain on jobs and also on stability. And money that we spend, that we put into failing state-owned entities meant that we've diverted essential funding from public services, education, health, and housing. That is why it's really important that we do care about corporate governance in state-owned companies. But failing state-owned companies also crowd out new entrepreneurs. So, you know, new entrepreneurs that would have set up businesses cannot do so because the space is dominated by failing SOEs. So it distorts the creation of new businesses. So the opportunity cost of failing SOEs really is very heavy for the economy. Then, of course, we've seen rising debt. The country expenditure cuts in the public sector, and also rising taxes to overcome the money spent on failing SOEs. And then, of course, government has been forced to secure loans from outside, from the International Monetary Fund, from the BRICS Bank, because we just don't have money in the public fiscus. We don't have the surpluses that our other country peers have, because we spent so much money on bailing out ineffective SOEs, and we're not getting the value for money. I mean, just to put it in context, the kind of money that we've spent the last decade or so on bailing out SOEs and also wastages in SOEs, we're talking here about up to 2 trillion. I mean, that's the kind of money that's gone. We can't get it back. So you just have to think about it, 2 trillion, what it means in opportunity costs, loss, potential growth, the money we could have invested in growth opportunities, in new businesses, in health, in education, in housing is gone. We can't get it back. So that really is why it is so important that we deal with corporate governance in state-owned companies. Now, let's look at a regulatory environment in the state-owned company space. You know, state-owned companies are governed by a number of very specific legislation. So some companies, state-owned companies, have their own enabling legislation. For example, say the Development Bank of Southern Africa, there will be a Development Bank Act. So, and these enabling acts really supersede all other regulations, and it governs many SOEs. But the Constitution, of course, is the overarching law, which is the supreme regulator. Then there is the PMFA as a financial management law that regulates the financial management in SOEs. Then there's the Companies Act. And often, unfortunately, and we'll come back later to it, when an entity has its own enabling its own specific legislative act that enables it to exist, that act becomes, it's over or supersede the Companies Act. Now, and I'll come back to it because often the enabling acts for entities are often much weaker than the Companies Act and often also outdated. Then there is a 2002 Protocol on Corporate Governance in the Public Sector, which almost is a bit, if one can compare it, almost like King Report on Corporate Governance in the Private Sector. Unfortunately, the 2002 Protocol on Corporate Governance in the Public Sector in South Africa is based on King 2, so it is outdated. The King Code on Corporate Governance, of course, has moved on since 2002, and unfortunately, the Protocol on Corporate Governance in the Public Sector that is still in existence is based on that old King 2 report. I'll come back to that also because it has significance for corporate governance in SOEs. Now, what are the broad governance structures that influence the SOE corporate governance environment? First, of course, is Parliament plays an oversight over SOEs, and particularly the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, which looks at the annual financial statements of SOEs. Then, of course, there's also the portfolio committees that reviews the non-financial information in annual reports of SOEs. The Auditor General, which is accountable to Parliament, but it also provides audit reports on SOEs. Then, of course, there's a Cabinet, shareholder and policy departments. And then there's a National Treasury. Now, the National Treasury in our Constitution has a constitutional role to regulate, play an oversight over the finances of public entities, including state-owned companies. And there's, of course, the Department of Public Service that regulates appointments in the public sector. And then there's the individual financial and public service mandate. And then, as I said, the government, which is the shareholder in some cases, but it's also the policymaker at the same time. It's also the regulator. And I'll come back to this, the role of the government as a shareholder and a policymaker and a regulator, what it means in terms of corporate governance. Now, the way our Constitution has been put together, our Constitution really makes provision for public finance oversight through a couple of ways. The first way is that we've got a national budget and where public expenditure is put together according to set plans. So it's not random, it's a set plans, and those plans also broadly influence spending at all levels of government. And then the Treasury has an entrenched role in our Constitution to oversee public finances, including in state-owned companies. Then, of course, the Auditor General that audit public expenditure. We've got an independent Reserve Bank, looks at monetary policy. We have the Financial and Fiscal Commission, which is an independent advisory institution, which looks at the division of revenue among the three spheres of government. And then a semi-independent South African Revenue Service that collects revenue. And then, of course, the executive organs to play oversight over public entities, such as the Public Protector, and so on. So there's a very unique, so our finances, the way it is, the oversight over our public finances are uniquely put into the constitution, or rather provisions have made for it, which is pretty unique, with these different levels of oversight mechanisms. Now, to start off, in a state-owned company, of course, government is often the main shareholder. And normally, there's a line minister, and the department is the executive authority. They play the role as the government shareholder, and they must ensure that there's a financial viability of the SOE. And that SOEs provide services according to certain requirements. And then we have a policy department often, and sometimes it's not the same. Policy department, what they do, they can be the same or they can be different to the executive authority or the shareholder department. And for example, in the case of Eskom, for example, where we have the policy department, it's different. Then the executive authority, you've got on the one hand public enterprises, and on the other hand the Department of Minerals and Energy. So that also has implications for governance, which I will come back later to. Then there's a treasury that oversees the SOE finance. It receives the corporate plans in conjunction with the executive authority that plays the shareholder role of an SOE. Now, often there's no coordination between the minister or the department is responsible for policy making, and the department is responsible for playing the shareholding role. And that also has implications for governance. There's often a poor coordination between the treasury itself and the shareholding department and policy department. Again, it has some implications for governments, because what it does is undermine the effectiveness of oversight, performance, and the financial viability of SOEs. Then the second layer of governance is SOE boards. Now, the executive authorities, and that is, as I said, the shareholder government, the shareholder representative, has the power to constitute a board and to dismiss directors. Now, in corporate governance, generally, the board should be governing the SOE, which they do. But when we have the case of the executive authority that has the power to constitute a board and to dismiss directors, often also, again, there's a conflict then between executive authority and the board itself, because if you think about it in the private sector, according to the Companies Act, it's the board that appoints the chairperson of a company or the CEO of the company, and recruits board members also. But nevertheless, in SOEs, the board is responsible for the performance of the SOE, and the board responsibilities are set out in the PFMA and then in the New Companies Act, and in the Protocol on Corporate Governance, and of course also in Treasury regulations. And both the PMFA and the protocol states that the relationship between the executive authority and boards should be governed by a shareholder compact. Now, I've said that, but what are the institutional challenges? Now, Parliament is supposed to play that oversight role over SOEs. So that oversight from Parliament is often weak. Weak along two lines. Often SCOPA, it's either not tough enough in the past, or either the non-financial or the portfolio committees that look at the non-financial performances of SOEs often don't have the capacity either to hold SOEs accountable. And often there's a lack of capacity in the executive authority. So in the departments that oversee SOEs, they often don't have the capacity. If you think about it, the Eskom reporting to a department, often the executives or the board in Eskom has much more capacity than, for example, the shareholder government departments. So, there's a mismatch. So it means that often government shareholder departments doesn't have the capacity to even understand the business that they oversee. And then the issue that I mentioned earlier, in cases where one government department is the shareholder and another government department is a policy department of one specific SOE, these two government departments often then talk at cross purposes. So they don't align their oversight over the entity. So the one department will have a different view, another department will have a different view, or they have different approaches. So because of that cross purposes, oversight then falls between the cracks. And then for the last couple of years, we've seen a confusion over the roles of executive authority and SOE boards. Should the executive authority, should the government department appoint board members, appoint chairpersons, appoint the CEO, or should that be the responsibility of the board? So there's absolute confusion. Sometimes it's, government takes control and appoint a CEO, appoint boards. On other occasions, the boards appoint the CEO, board and other board members. And what we've seen often in the cases where it is the SOE boards who are in control of appointments of CEOs and chairpersons and so on, they are actually appearing to function much better than those where we see the government department exclusively appoint board members and the CEO. Then there's a couple of legislative challenges. There are multiple legislation that governs corporate governance and state-owned entities. Now that causes so much confusion. And of course, it's not only in a corporate governance space. I mean, we've seen it in other spaces in the public sector broadly. For example, in procurement, there's so many different pieces of legislation, codes, and so on. So at the end of the day, no one knows, which is the ultimate or the priority law or legislation or protocol to follow. And then the weakness really, the protocol on corporate governance is supposed to serve the same function as, let's say, the King protocols in the private sector. In the public sector, the protocol is a guide only. So, it's not compulsory, it's only a guide. And then secondly, also, it is outdated. It is, it is sort of based on corporate governance in prior to the 2009 times. The other weakness is, and I mentioned it earlier, is that some entities that are governed by enabling legislation, those enabling legislation overrides the Companies Act. So if the Companies Act is so much more robust and so much more updated, if compared to many of the enabling legislations of companies. I mean, I, in 2009, 2010, was advisor to the Presidential Review Committee on state-owned enterprises. And one of the things that I had to look at, for the committee was at some of the enabling legislation of state-owned companies. So some of them, unfortunately, are still there from periods after the 1930s and 1940s. And since the 1930s, 1940s, corporate governance has moved on, but many entities are still governed, by such old original acts. And then in some cases, ministers can also exempt SOEs from aspects of law, of some of the governing laws. So now this is a very, very crucial point, because that exemption can also be used for nefarious purposes, not for the good. And then, although we have such, it looks a really beautiful constitutional financial oversight, all of that oversight is dispersed. And it's not focused on SOEs. It's not, you know, it could be better. You know, we could tighten up the financial oversight over SOEs. I just for example, I mean, the Auditor General issue reports, but often state entities can ignore these reports, and then there is no, you know, there's no ways to hold them accountable to Auditor General reports. I mean, we've seen in the last 5 years, year after year, the Auditor General comes up with reports on SOE finances, but we don't see SOEs being held accountable. And the same with Department of Public Service and Administration rules of appointment are often ignored by SOEs without any accountability. I mean, if you look at it, this year, for example, many SOEs have not provided their financials. Some SOEs for the last 2 or 3 years have never reported finances. But you know, there's been no accountability, no ways to hold them accountable. There's some stakeholder challenges also in the corporate governance space. In other countries, citizens and consumers and civil societies organizations play a much more active role in holding SOEs accountable than in South Africa. And often SOE annual general meetings are often secretive affairs. Information are not widely available or publicized and often not open to the public. Again, you know, in many countries where we've seen where there's very efficient SOEs, one of the things that people do effectively in countries where SOE seems to be performing better is that annual general meetings of SOEs are often open to the public and often open to ordinary citizens so that they can engage, like in the private sector, with the management of SOEs and with the boards of SOEs. And again, also media reporting on SOE governance challenges are often also ignored by public authorities. Now, broadly, you know, SOEs don't, of course, don't operate in a vacuum. They operate within our society. Now, what is happening in our society? We've got system capture in our society. It's like almost like the whole society system has been captured by corruption. So, you know, from the party captured, you know, governing party, aspects of the ANC has been captured, aspects of the state has been captured, of parliament, democratic institutions, even policies have in many cases been manipulated and captured, you know, for self-interest. And then also the administrative culture of the state itself have in many cases been captured. People are often appointed because of their political connectedness, not necessarily because of their skills, and so on. And as I say, the capture often of laws and policies and even the regulatory frameworks, even often regulators in many cases have been captured. People have been appointed there deliberately, who are incompetent or who are appointed to look the other way when they see wrongdoing. And in many cases, there's been a capture of police and investigation and prosecuting authorities. We've seen it the last decades. And then there's been generally in the country a culture of ignoring laws, codes, and regulations because there's no accountability, because people can see others getting away with it, and then they also try go ahead with wrongdoing because there is no prosecution, there's no accountability. Now, what reforms do we need? The very first thing is to start off by clarifying the respective role of government as a shareholder. What is the role of government as a shareholder? What is the role of government as a policymaker? And then what is the role of government as a regulator? And then how do we, and then to build walls between the three roles. So it's not as muddled as it is now. Then SOEs are supposed to have shareholder compacts. Now, there's been a weakness in the shareholder compacts is that there's no clear, often there are no shareholder compacts, although they should, SOEs should have it. Many SOEs don't have that basic shareholder compact. Now, shareholder compact sets out the responsibility of the company and the targets, how the company is going to achieve it, and so on. So often they don't have it, but government don't hold these SOEs accountable. They don't have it, and also citizens and civil society don't hold SOEs accountable. It doesn't have shareholder compacts. But so the minimum is to get their shareholder compacts, but also to put clear performance expectations in those shareholder compacts, measurable, so that government, parliament, citizens, civil society can see what is in there, make it public, and can then monitor the performance of SOEs. And then, of course, Parliament's oversight over SOEs should be dramatically strengthened. I mean, the last couple of months we have seen, or last couple of years or so, we have seen there's been a change, but it's not enough. There really has to be a much more robust oversight by Parliament, both SCOPA and then also the other, portfolio committees that looks at the non-financial aspects of public entities, that they should become much more robust in their oversight. And then the Auditor General recommendations, in the past, it hasn't been binding. So again, those recommendations from the Audit Committee, people, SOEs and their leadership must be held accountable for implementing recommendations from the Auditor General. And then what we also need is regular interaction between SOEs and stakeholders. So SOEs should regularly consult with consumers, citizens, civil society, the media, explain what they do, have an open door policy so that other stakeholders can hold them accountable. And of course, also a more active oversight by citizens, consumers, civil society, and the media. We need to strengthen the boards of SOEs. Firstly, the board should be empowered so that the boards make the appointments of CEOs, of other board members, that the boards actually hold the oversight. But we must also hold the boards, after we've done that, more accountable. If something goes wrong in an entity, individual board members should be held accountable. So far, that hasn't been much of the case. In the public, there's always debate about holding individual board members accountable, but that's often never the case. But board appointments must be made more transparent. Politicians should be barred from board appointments. So if you, in the party, if party leadership, you should not be allowed to be on a state-owned company board. Civil servants should also be barred from boards. I mean, we've got a case it's quite regular in South Africa for civil servants to sit on boards. We should stop that practice. And then we also should insist on public participation in all SOE board appointments. And then a regular assessment of the performance of board members, and these assessments must be made publicly available so that we all know, how board members perform in relation to the performance of an entity itself. And then there has to be regular lifestyle audits of board members also to see, conflicts of interest, And these lifestyle orders the results must also be made public. And they must be made, we will have to introduce mechanisms to contest board appointments. Because often what we've seen the last couple of years, the same people get recycled on boards. So, you know, we recycle failure from one entity to another. Yet the country has such a wide pool of talent. So there has to be mechanisms to contest, not only in courts, but we have to introduce other mechanisms where any citizen can actually contest an appointment of an incompetent person or a corrupt person onto an SOE board. So what can civil society, the private sector, and citizens do? The very first thing is for citizens to form consumer groups. So if you are a recipient of service from a public entity, for people to band together and form associations and pressure groups to make certain that these entities are accountable, that the service delivery is up to standard and up to quality. We also should see more user forums, including customers and watchdogs and community groups to monitor the quality of services of SOEs. It must become mandatory for SOEs to open their AGMs to ordinary citizens. And then citizens and consumers and civil society should be given voting rights at SOE shareholder meetings. So, I mean, to end off, a very big missing element in the SOE corporate governance space in South Africa is that citizens are not enough. They are not active shareholders. And that really, if we want to turn around SOEs, we'll have to get much more active citizens, and citizens must become active shareholders, holding SOEs account, holding boards account, holding CEOs account. And that has been one really important missing element in the corporate governance menu in South Africa. What I will now, this comes to an end of my presentation, so I will now respond to questions. I've got one question so far. The question is, would you say one of the most effective ways of making certain that SOE management is held accountable if there's a clear differentiation between the political party in government and the executive of those entities? Yes, unfortunately, at the moment, is in South Africa, it appears that we have what we can call a party state, where many ANC leaders cannot differentiate between the party and the state, where people think the party and the state is the same thing. So really, we're going to have to deal with that, because that's in the case of a party state, if the party is corrupt or the members of the party is incompetent, then the state will also be corrupt, and the state will also have a culture of incompetence. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it also will mean that the negative impact of that situation, of a party state situation, that is the case at the moment, is that the appointments to the states are often then made not on the basis of people's qualifications or their merits or their skills, but based on their party loyalty or their party credentials. And that is one of the reasons why state-owned companies fail. Now, that is also the reason, of course, since the Second World War, in the post-colonial periods, why most state-owned companies, almost every state-owned company in the African post-colonial period have failed. I mean, there are very, very few exceptions where they've done well, precisely because of this reason, where the party state, where people are appointed to run really complex organizations, like energy utilities or water utilities, without the skills, without the technical skills or the management skills, but the skills they have is the skills of being loyal party cadres. There's a second question about the social democratic whether the social democratic model in Northern Europe with trade unions and worker representation on the boards of companies, whether they could be a method for South Africa. Yes, I think what we need to do, it's essential that we broaden representation on boards of state-owned companies. So when I say broaden representation, it means, many of our state-owned companies, when you go randomly, go to a state-owned company, on the profile and you look at the boards, you often would see that many state-owned companies, the boards lack the diversity. So diversity in terms of skills, diversity in terms of gender, diversity in terms of race, diversity in terms of stakeholders, and so on. Now, and that really is, I think, one of the reasons why many state-owned companies are inefficient, because if you don't have the diversity on your board and on your management of skill set, bring different type of views on it, and understanding the market that you're operating in, it becomes a problem. So, and in a South African context, if we could bring, in terms of diversity, if we can bring trade unions on board, if we can bring in other stakeholders, consumers or users of services also on the board, I think it really will help from a corporate governance point of view, and also from an efficiency point of view. I'm just going to check, Lerato, my colleague, I'll just see if, from you, if there are any questions from on Facebook.
No, none on our side.
Yeah.
Okay, William,
I mean, I just...
Yeah,
yes.
You could just check. I'm sorry, I was speaking to all of the attendees. If there's any questions and that you would like to ask, you could either raise your hand, because we do have some time left. You can raise your hand or put them in the chat function. And if there isn't, William, we can wrap up the session. Let's just give people a moment.
I mean, just back on while we wait a bit, on the question of the diversity of boards, just think about Eskom over the last decades. When you look at it, at a period when Eskom was really doing well, and it was among the top 10 energy providers in the world. And if you look at the board at the time of Eskom, and you would see the board was very diverse skills. It had diverse technical skills, business skills, different types of skills. So the skills that will be important in guiding the organization. So from technical to management to skill set from, abroad, people from other successful entities. So a really diverse set of skill set. Now, often boards are often seen by many people as, or are not seen as providing the skill set to guide organizations, because boards have become so politicized that appointments are not based on skills or diversity and so on. So you get boards that actually don't provide any value to an organization. In fact, the boards becomes an inhibitor. It cause inefficiencies in organizations. I think what I'll do now, given the fact that there's no more questions, I think just to thank everyone for sitting in. And this comes to the end of the session, and also to to thank my organizers, my colleagues who've been administratively organizing all the master classes. All right, there's one. Sorry, before I go, there's just one question.
There is one more question there.
Yeah.
Okay.
The question is: do you think that Dudu Myeni Saga has set a precedent to board members to act faithfully in discharging their duties as board members? I think so. And again, unfortunately, firstly on the Dudu Myeni saga is that the most important thing there for me is that civil society organizations actually became active and went to court to say, well, here is a board member, a chairperson of an organization that really is a delinquent, a person who really has managed the organization really badly. Now, before, government did not do anything. So did not hold her or that board as the then SAA board accountable. So it's very, very important. Sort of missing link in a corporate governance is this lack of government holding the boards accountable. So I think if government doesn't hold boards accountable, citizens must go to court in the similar ways that civil society group went to court to hold Dudu Myeni accountable. And I think from now onwards, I definitely think that SOE board members will be much more judicious, more careful, about how they behave, how they manage these entities, and how they play their oversight role, because that court case and set a precedent for other civil society groups and citizens to also to take other board members who are either incompetent or corrupt or mismanage entities to court, also to hold them personally accountable and to declare them delinquent board members. Thank you for the questions. And again, to thank you all for attending the session. And again, to thank you to the administrative group at the School of Governance that made it all possible. And stay safe. We hope those of you who are thinking about enrolling at university for programs to choose the School of Governance. There's some very exciting courses, ideas, exciting direction going forward in the post-COVID-19 era. So thank you all of the best. Stay safe. Bye-bye.